You'll reshoot, tag you, and then you can set up a light. But they usually know, especially like when it initially starts back to right? Nobody needs weird. Usually like. Long term. Like I'm a rock climber. So in rock climbing, like still, it's been around for a while, but it's not like as a competitive sport. It's actually only around. Like now it's like phase now. It's like sport. It's still like it's one of those sports that still lacks like already real like clients that make like learning how to train for it. So most people like train like for climbers like even myself just about trial. There's no like there's no very like way of like training clients to do it right. Like you see where that about like injuries wise, the way to teach them.
Hello, hello. Okay.
Did meet for Friday. Friday was canceled for us, so you don't.
Okay. Friday's meet canceled.
I have one too, but this is like the championship, so we probably won't make it that far. And then this is just if we leave that early. So I'll let you know when we find out like when we actually leave. Because it doesn't say.
Okay,
But just keep it up.
okay. Great, thank you. Hey, Kels. How you doing? How much longer do you have in the dugout?
I come out Friday night, so I'll be there Monday.
Okay, I'll look forward to it. I just got this computer Monday, and Monday night, when I tried to do Zoom and share the screen, it crashed. So if something happens like that, I'll just try and shut it down and reconnect. Just don't be surprised if things go kablooey, because they have in the past. So happens with new machines.
Okay.
That's the way it goes.
Okay.
All right, it's time to start. So I'm gonna share the screen. Okay. Okay, folks. So my computer went kablooey on Monday. That's a highly technical term, kablooey. And I got a new machine. And Monday night, this machine during Zoom just packed up and stopped working. So if that happens in the middle of today's lecture, then I may have to shut it off, restart, try again. I know it's a pain. Secondly, if anyone has been in this room before, is there a way to turn this on without turning that on? Because when you turn this one on, that one turns on, and it puts this irritating glow on the screen. Plus, I'm staring at a laser beam the whole lecture. Is there a way to not do that? Does anyone know? No? Do you want to stand on my shoulders then? John's not here. I'd throw you on John's shoulders, but he's tall enough. But that thing is, when you turn this on, that goes on too. Now, my understanding is that this is created so that you can close that and have two rooms, in which case then someone could potentially shut off the projector in the other room, which makes no sense to me. That didn't work either. Yeah, I tried that the day before. I just wondered if I was pushing the wrong buttons. Nobody seems to know, but boy, that's annoying. So we'll just do what we have with the technology we have and hope that it works. You know, it is what it is. And I'll just do the best I can. I never taught in this building before. So done Bible quizzing in this building. Remember, Lydia? Yep. You were on that team. It was right over here, I think, where you guys were, you and your brothers. Boy, gosh, you guys were a good team. All right, let's pray and then we'll get started on pharmacodynamics. Lord, we thank you for a cold day. We pray now that you would warm us up and help us understand this rather complex topic. Thank you for every person here. For those on Zoom, help them to feel better. If they're not feeling better, help them to get off quarantine. Help us all to live wisely and continue to have a record on COVID-19 that we can at least be proud of. In Jesus' name, amen. Oh, in the way of good news, I know most of the news we read these days is not good news. So let me see if I can maybe give you a little bit of good news here. So where is it? Oh, here it is. So the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is two doses, and now it's not showing on that screen. Okay, stop share. You know, if I mess with anything, I'm afraid I'm gonna go screw things up. Anyway, I'll just read it to you. This is online. I put the link online. The AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which, let's see, our country has bought 50 million doses of it, but we're not going to get it probably until late March, early April. First shot looks like gives you 76% protection just after the first dose. And then when you get your second dose, usually about 28 days later, you get over 90%. This shot, the Oxford AstraZeneca, is only $3 a shot. So it's the cheapest out of all the vaccines. Also, this one only needs to be stored in a refrigerator. You don't need liquid nitrogen to cool the thing or have to ship it in -70 freezers or something like that. So this is a chimp adenovirus-based vaccine. The chimp adenovirus infects your cells. The cells make the spike protein. Then the spike protein is presented to the immune system. The adenovirus does not permanently reprogram your cells, just temporarily reprograms your cells, and you make the spike protein, and then you get a robust immune response to it, and you get good protection from it. So that's the other vaccine. Our FDA has not yet approved it but hopefully they'll prove it soon. Okay, back to our slideshow here. Oh, no, 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 no. Come on, you. Come on. There we go. All right, there we are. Pharmacodynamics. So when you take a drug, the drug does something to you. The study of what the drug does to you is called pharmacodynamics. Pharmacokinetics. That's what you do, your body does to the drug. And so this will be all about how the drug is absorbed, distributed, metabolized, eliminated. This is about the targets that the drug interacts with. Those targets very often are receptors or enzymes, or they might be some other small molecule or something like that. Et cetera, so on and so forth. So the subject for the day is pharmacodynamics. Now, the relationship between the drug and the receptor depends upon the dose of the drug, but it also depends upon the affinity of the receptor for the drug. Now, let me introduce you to a new term, and that term is agonist. Agonist. A-G-O-N-I-S-T. So if a molecule binds to a receptor and elicits a physiological response from that receptor, that molecule that binds to the receptor is called an agonist. An agonist. So in your heart, for example, you have beta 1 adrenergic receptors in the heart. These are normally bound by norepinephrine, or they can also be bound by epinephrine. So these activate this receptor when they bind to it. These are agonists. These molecules are not only agonists, they activate it completely. So they are full agonists, full agonists. Sometimes a molecule can bind to a receptor and only sort of activate it. Now, be careful here. This has nothing to do with the affinity of the molecule for the receptor. The receptor can have a very high affinity for the molecule and still not have complete activation of whatever the receptor does. But some things bind to receptors and only partially activate them. Those are partial agonists. Partial agonists. So there's a drug called Pindolol. Pindolol binds to the beta-1 receptor and only slightly activates it. It's a partial agonist of the beta-1 receptor. Then some molecules bind and they don't elicit any response at all. In fact, when they bind, they get in the way of the regular ligand. Because of that, they antagonize the receptor. Therefore, those are called antagonists. Antagonists. And so if we were to use another drug called atenolol, atenolol is an antagonist for the beta-1 receptor. It binds to it and blocks it, and blocks it. We will look at drugs that fit in all three categories. This clear? Now, we can measure the relationship between the dose or concentration of a drug and its pharmacological effect. This is something that biochemists, pharmacologists are very good at. So the receptor tends to be selective. Selective. And when you are designing drugs to bind to a receptor, you have to make sure that that molecule still fits the receptor. How tightly does it bind the receptor? You do these kinds of studies, binding studies, that can determine that. So the binding of the drug to the receptor is selective. It also determines the action of the drug. And as we said, if it activates the receptor when it binds to it, it is an agonist. It will mimic the action of a naturally occurring substance. Mimic the action of a naturally occurring substance. So let's say you're on the soccer pitch. You're playing soccer with your buddies. All of a sudden, all that running around, all that excitement, all of a sudden your chest starts to tighten. You're having trouble breathing. When you start to breathe, you get a wheeze. When you start to breathe. Anybody know what that's called? Exercise-induced asthma. Exercise-induced asthma. The smooth muscle around your bronchial tubes, your airways, has contracted, and your airways go from this diameter to that diameter. Now, you have a set of nerves that innervate those muscles. They're sympathetic nerves. They release norepinephrine. At this time, you don't have enough to keep those muscles from contracting. So you're going to inhale a beta-2 adrenergic agonist, like albuterol. You take albuterol and you give a puff of it, and now those muscles relax and your airways now do this because you took an agonist, which mimics the activity of norepinephrine. All right, so if you do a concentration versus effect curve, it looks like this. And this sort of thing, I could take in a lab, I can show you how to do it. It's not that hard to do. You get a curve that looks like this. You get some sort of effect the cell elongates, blood pressure goes down, the blood clots, the clot gets dissolved, whatever. Put whatever effect in there you want. You have some sort of assay for it. That's what it is essentially there. Here's your drug concentration. It will be hyperbolic and it will asymptote up here. There'll be a point at which you could put more drug in, more drug in, more drug in. You're not going to get any more effect. This will be the 100%. So this will asymptote at that point. And then there's a point at which you get 1/2 the drug effect, the concentration at which you get 1/2 the biological effect is called the EC50. The EC50. Now, this is useful physiologically. Let's turn this into something a little more useful biochemically. And if we do that, we can express this as the number of receptors that are bound per drug concentration, because usually the biological effect is pretty directly related to the number of receptors that are bound. So this would be the percentage of receptors that are bound. Here's the drug concentration. Once again, there comes a point where you could give more drug, more drug, more drug, more drug, and you're going to get the same percentage of receptors that are bound. It's also a hyperbolic line. The number, or rather the concentration of drug at which 50% of the receptors are bound is called the K, capital K sub D. K sub D. Now the lower the K sub D, the higher the affinity of the receptor for the drug. The lower the K sub D, the higher the affinity of the receptor for that drug. And conversely, the higher the KD, the lower the affinity of the receptor for the drug, so on and so forth. You get my point. Now, KD and EC50 are not the same thing. Can somebody tell me why? You've pretty much, yeah, that's pretty much it. There's not a one-to-one relationship between receptor being bound and the physiological response. Some responses require lots of receptor to be occupied. Some responses require a little bit of receptor to be occupied. It's not the same for each pathway. So that's why these two numbers are not the same. Between the amount of receptor occupied, the proportion of receptors that are occupied, and the biological effect you get from that receptor. So for example, insulin. You can have very few insulin molecules that bind to insulin receptors, and you get a robust response from the insulin receptor. Whereas you could take something like growth hormone. Growth hormone, you don't get nearly as robust a response unless most of the growth hormone receptors are occupied. That's just to kind of pull two examples out of the air. So it's not one-to-one binding of receptors and biological response. This is a strictly biochemical measurement. This is a physiological measurement. And the two are not often one-to-one. They're 6 of one, 12 of the other, 24 of the other, 108 of the other, so on and so forth. Yeah, John.
So like the way the graph is that just a generalization, or is it to imply that like your first initial doses have the most?
Well, there again, it's going to depend. If you get lots of activity from small numbers of receptors being occupied, then yes. If that's not the case, then no. It's going to depend on the ligand, on the system, and also, as we'll see later, it'll also depend on the age of the patient, because certain pathways in older people get more sensitive, other pathways get less sensitive. So it's going to depend. And also, there's probably individual variation from person to person as well. Now, to measure the affinity of a ligand for its receptor, you use something called a scatter plot. And scattering analysis simply involves the use of an equation. This equation is actually pretty easily derived. This is not magic. This is straight out of enzyme kinetics, essentially. There's no magic here, but essentially, these are all things you can measure. So this equation gives you things that you can measure. Because of that, you can calculate the KD usually with a high degree of accuracy. So KDs, consequently, are extremely well characterized for most drugs. They're derived in laboratories using very standard techniques that are reproduced in labs all over the world. These numbers are not guesses. They're actually experimentally derived numbers that you need to take to heart, because they're not things that people make guesses at. They're actual real numbers. And because many of the receptors are proteins that you're going to express in cells in the laboratory, you can like the beta-1 adrenergic receptor, or the beta-2 adrenergic receptor, or the insulin receptor, or the glucagon receptor, or the thyroid hormone receptor, vitamin D receptor, blah, 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 blah. And the punchline is, these are things you can measure with a high degree of accuracy, very high degree of accuracy. And just very simply, here's how you do this. You'd take cells that express the hormone receptor. That's very easy to do nowadays. You call up any sort of company that has a gene for it. You put the gene in the cells, you transfect them using standard protocols. You express that receptor. You can usually induce it even. There are inducible ways to express it. You then take that receptor expressing cell line, you give it hormone that you've labeled. You used to, in the old days, label it with radioactivity. Nobody uses radioactivity anymore. Now you label it with usually a enzyme, so that the enzyme will activate a chromophore when it's bound to the receptor, but when it's not, it won't. And then you can determine, you know how much hormone you put on the cells, you know how much hormone is glowing on those cells. You measure the amount of glow, and then you subtract the amount on the cells from the amount that you divide rather. The amount that's on the cells, the amount you put on, and then measure that for different concentrations of hormone. Not hard to do at all. And if you do that, you can get a graph. If you use that equation I showed you, you graph essentially the hormone bound to the receptor, the ratio bound hormone versus free hormone, and then you graph that versus bound hormone, you get a straight line, and the slope is -1/kd. And this can be done in a computer. You just put the data in the computer, and the computer goes kaplunk, and it calculates kd. That's really all there is to it. So this, again, is not a guess. Now, if you look at graphs of full agonists versus partial agonists versus antagonists, and you're looking here at biological effect, so in this case would be pain relief, here's what you get with a full agonist. This is methadone. That's a full agonist of the mu opioid receptor. You get a nice, beautiful, full biologic response. Here's what you get with a partial agonist. You get a partial response. You can give more and more and more drug, doesn't matter. You're only going to get a partial response. And here is an antagonist, naloxone. You might know naloxone by another name, Narcan. Narcan is given to people who've overdosed. Comes as a nasal spray. EMTs carry it, cops carry it, firefighters carry it. And if you get trained in emergency procedures, you get trained how to administer Narcan. Some of you have had first aid training, have probably been trained to administer it. Any of you had first aid training? Well, some of you will in the future. It's easy to administer, and usually when you give it, people come to right away. They feel terrible, they feel like caca, but at least they're awake, at least they're breathing, so on and so forth. And usually you still have to call the ambulance, and they still have to go on the ambulance. And you still get a visit usually from Mr. or Mrs. Policeman too. Now, buprenorphine can be used to actually treat people with opiate addiction, opiate use disorder, because they can't get high off this drug. Can you see why? It's partial agonist. So it can take the edge off their feeling, but they're not going to get the euphoria that they would get off a full agonist like heroin or oxycodone or morphine or fentanyl or fill in the blank. And buprenorphine is a product that doctors can actually prescribe if they have an add-on to their DEA license that they have to take a special class for it, that then allows them to prescribe this to people with substance abuse disorder because it's a partial agonist. And this graph has got a lot of stuff going on, but essentially it shows you if you have a full agonist, so this is the fraction of the maximum response, that response is then compromised by adding a partial agonist. Now, the response provided by the full agonist actually goes down as you give a partial agonist. Now your response goes from full to partial. And that is essentially the usefulness of partial agonists, is they can take what a full agonist, like what epinephrine and norepinephrine might do to your heart, and you can now have half of response, so your heart doesn't beat quite as fast or something like that. No, usually the full agonist is already in your body. So if you were to give an antagonist, this response would go like this, to 0, and your heart stops beating. Is that good? No. So with this, now your heart, instead of beating at 100 beats per minute, now beats about 60, which is what you want. There are cases, though, Allison, where you would give 2 drugs together, one a full, one a partial agonist. There are cases where you might do that. In that case, you have to be really careful about dosage. Now, antagonism comes in a couple of different flavors. A competitive antagonist binds a target, releases, binds a target, releases, binds a target, releases. So the full agonist and the antagonist compete for the site. Who's going to win? Depends on concentration. Higher the concentration, usually the other wins, or affinity may determine that's the winner in that fight as well. But you don't get a permanent construct between the receptor or the target and the antagonist. An irreversible antagonist forms a bond with the target and permanently inactivates the target. So for example, ibuprofen is a competitive inhibitor of the target cyclooxygenase 1 and 2. Aspirin, however, is a irreversible antagonist. It forms a bond with COX-1 and 2 and permanently inactivates them. The cell now has to remake them. That was hard to hear. Say that again. Yes, there are. There are. So the penicillin group of antibiotics form a permanent adduct with the cell wall synthesizing enzyme of bacteria. That's good. You don't want infecting bacteria to be there to give you trouble. So they kill the bacteria, no issue. Competitive antagonists work as long as they're there. So inhibit it temporarily. Say you have a migraine. Do you want your brain function to stop? No, but you want your migraine to go away. So use a competitive antagonist, takes the headache, goes away, then your brain, the medicine then goes away, and your brain keeps functioning. So it turns out with a migraine, there are waves of things that occur that actually cause the migraine. That goes away. By the time that goes away, the drug has gone away, now you can think straight. And migraine medicines will cause brain fog and stuff like that, but so do migraines. So you don't care about that. That's one of the advantages of competitive antagonists. Also, this gets back to what we talked about first lecture. Some drugs get trapped in some compartments of your body. So you're going to get a high concentration of them in certain parts of your body. The fact that they're competitive is good, because in that case, they're going to work, and they're going to work for a while until they get cleared from that compartment. Now, the side effects will be low if it's not getting trapped anywhere else. That also can happen as well. So yeah, there are pros and there are cons depending on the drug. There we go. Let me stop here, see if there are any questions before we go on to the way some of these different signal transduction pathways work. Questions? Nope. Then let me take a sip of water, and then we'll move on. The problem with glasses and masks. Very good. Now, how many of you have played the board game Mousetrap? Okay, most of you. So with Mousetrap, you go around the board and you assemble this elaborate machine that eventually culminates in the catching of the mouse. When you bind a receptor on the surface of a cell, you set into motion a machinery inside the cell, and that machinery will elicit responses inside the cell. Very often, these pathways will remind you of Mousetrap because the pathways are elaborate, but they culminate in changing the behavior of the cell. I am going to talk about some of these pathways. Some of these pathways are complicated. I just want you to get the basic outlines of the pathway, not the gory details. You're going to look at these and you're going to say, good golly, I have to know all that. Well, not really. You have to know the outlines of it. Reason being is that these drugs tend to affect different pathways. If you understand that some of these pathways overlap, you'll understand why some of these drugs interact. So we'll start by looking at certain drugs that don't work at the cell membrane. Instead, they charge right through the cell membrane, and those are the steroids. The steroids. Steroids are fat soluble. They're fat soluble. They don't bind to receptors on the surface of cells. They don't need to. So they're able to go right through cell membranes, just like the steroid hormones in your body, just like cortisol, just like testosterone, just like estrogen, just like whatever. They then bind to receptors inside the cell. Those receptors, when bound by the steroid, now are able to directly go into the nucleus and bind DNA. And when they bind DNA, they cause changes in gene expression. So steroids will cause direct changes in gene expression. Because of this mode of action, steroids will tend to act very quickly. And if any of you know anyone with really severe allergies, if they get prednisone, that prednisone will tend to work very fast. Prednisone is a steroid anti-inflammatory drug. Let's see, Medrol. Sometimes that stuff gets called Medrol. It's usually just generic. This is an old drug now. But prednisone is an example of a steroid drug. You've probably heard of this drug that's being used to treat patients with severe COVID-19, dexamethasone. Dexamethasone is also a steroid drug. Works very quickly, does not bind to a surface receptor, doesn't need to, goes straight through the membrane. All right, so let's now take a look at a video that shows you how the steroid receptor pathway works. Come on, sound. It's not working. Okay, what's not working here? Okay, you're high, you're up, you're up, you're up. Okay, you're on, you're on, you're on. Nope, still not working. Well, okay, I'll just talk you through it. Okay, so there's a steroid, goes through, and here's the receptor. This is a gene family of receptors. When they bind, they have sequences that are exposed. They can now pass into the nucleus. Now, once they get into the nucleus, there are specific sequences of DNA that they're able to bind to. These are called hormone response elements. They're different for every hormone and every hormone, steroid hormone receptor. These then will recruit RNA polymerase to the DNA, and you'll get transcription of messenger RNAs. They'll be translated by ribosomes into protein. Those proteins will then elicit changes in the response of the cell. Call, oh gosh. And if you watch that online, hopefully you'll be able to see the sound. I'm really disappointed that didn't work, but hey, it's the way it goes. All right, so come on, you. All right, so steroids again, fat soluble, don't need to bind a surface receptor. They diffuse through the membrane and they bind to their steroid receptor inside the cell. Inside the cell. Each steroid has a different protein receptor. So estrogen has its estrogen receptors. Progesterone has its own progesterone receptors. Testosterone has its own testosterone receptors, so on and so forth. When bound, these can enter the nucleus. When they enter the nucleus, they're then going to become transcriptional activators. That means they activate the production of messenger RNA by the cell, specific messenger RNAs. These target specific genes. And then when they target the expression of those specific genes, they will then elicit changes in cell behavior. Those are the steroids. That's how steroids work. What I want you to take home from that, steroids work inside cells. They don't work at the surface. They cause direct changes in gene expression. Therefore, they tend to work relatively quickly. And that video I showed you is online. If you want to watch it at your leisure, feel free to do so. All right, any questions about steroids and a steroid signal? The bulk of receptors are found at the cell surface. When they are bound, they will elicit a change inside the cell. There are a few main pathways I'd like us to look at that drugs are going to exploit, essentially. These pathways are called signal transduction pathways. And if you want to think of a signal transduction pathway, think of mousetrap. And think of how the turning the crank gets the ball to move. That causes the ball to go down and then cause a little guy to jump into the little swimming pool that rattles the other line that gets the ball to move over here, that hits the little post that causes the little trap to go down and trap the mouse. And those of you who haven't played Mousetrap don't know what I'm talking about, but it's this elaborate setup, essentially. Oh, you guys are way too young to remember Rube Goldberg. Rube Goldberg used to do this column in the, was it the New York Times? I forget which newspaper, but it was nationally syndicated. He used to do these cartoons of these elaborate machines that made no sense, but they got the job done. So there was a back scratcher. You could essentially just kind of push a pedal, and this pedal would lead to a machine that would go all the way around the house and it would cause it to scratch your back while you read the paper or some nonsense like that. Anyway, these are sorts of things. These are kind of like Rube Goldberg machines. And try to find some of those online. You don't have them anymore. They're too old. All right, so here's the first of the pathways I'd like us to consider. So the first are the G protein coupled receptors. G protein coupled receptors. G protein coupled receptors pass through the membrane 7 times. Because of this, you can identify them somewhat easily. They're embedded in the membrane. They bind to a ligand. And then on the inside of the cell. So there's 2 pieces of the protein. One piece sticks to the outside and it binds the agonist, binds the ligand, binds the hormone, binds the whatever. The other piece sticks to the inside of the cell. And the piece that sticks to the inside of the cell is associated with a protein on the inside of the cell called a G protein, G. This just underscores the importance of G protein coupled receptors. This is a huge, huge gene family. Lots of neurotransmitters, lots of peptide hormones, neuropeptides, immune cytokines, what have you. Other types of hormones use G protein coupled receptors. This, for our purposes, is probably the biggest group of receptors we need to be concerned with. So it's really important. Okay, back to G proteins. So they pass through the membrane 7 times, and here is their structure. So outside, inside, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, this G protein on the inside of the cell is 3 parts, has 3 parts. And these 3 parts are called very creatively alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha, beta, and gamma. So this is embedded in the membrane. The G protein coupled receptor. The receptor binds the ligand, the hormone, the whatever. The G protein that's associated with the receptor is on the inside of the cell. Now, the first of the G protein subunits, the alpha subunit, is bound to the receptor when the receptor is not bound to its hormone, ligand, whatever. And it is inactive in this case, and the alpha subunit is bound to GDP. So this situation that you see right here, this is inactive. And here are your 2 other subunits, beta subunit, gamma subunit. They're all just kind of one big inactive happy family. Now, when this receptor is bound by its hormone or whatever binds it, the receptor changes shape. Because the receptor changes shape, the alpha subunit spits out the GDP and takes up a GTP. And that exchange activates the G protein. It activates the G protein. And when the G protein is activated, it dissociates from the receptor. So it goes from this inactive state to this active state. The alpha subunit will then go activate downstream targets. What is that downstream target? It depends on the type of alpha subunit that it happens to be. There's different types of alpha subunits. They tend to activate different targets. One target, however, of one specific G alpha subunit, the so-called G alpha S subunit, is this protein that you find in the cell membrane called adenylate cyclase or adenylyl cyclase. What does adenylate cyclase do? Adenylate cyclase is going to take ATP and it's going to convert it to cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is what we call a second messenger. A second messenger. What is a second messenger? Second messengers are made in cells. They're small molecules. They can diffuse throughout the cell, and they have very profound biological effects inside that cell. And finding one receptor can usually produce hundreds of molecules of cyclic AMP. So this is a step of amplification. And then cyclic AMP will go on to do other things, which we'll look at later. But this is essentially how your G protein coupled receptors work. Before we talk about cyclic AMP, let's take a look at a video. Hi, Jess. Where's my video? Right. Okay. Now this video is a really good video, and it has good narration, but we can't get the narration. Well, let me take responsibility. I can't get the narration to work on here. So I'll have to kind of narrate it as we go. Well, there it goes. So here is your, oh, it's not showing on the blasted screen. Okay. What is up with this? Oh, I think I know what the problem is. Okay, now let's go back. Really mess things up, it takes a computer. Okay, now you can see it. All right, here's our G protein coupled receptor. And we're going to get the G protein here. And it's paused. Oh, good gracious glory. There. Play, you fiend. Okay. Here's a receptor. There's your ligand, you know, whatever the ligand is. Changes shape when it binds this ligand. Then you have your G protein, alpha, beta, gamma subunits, GDP. This is inactive. When this binds to the ligand, this is going to spit out the GDP, and this, yes, is bound to the membrane by these lipid tails here. So it doesn't just go floating off into affinity there. Okay, yeah, we get it. Come on now. Okay, here we go. So now the alpha subunit is going to spit out the GDP and take up a GTP, just like this. And now it's active. It'll dissociate from the G protein and it will go activate downstream targets just like you see there. The beta gamma also dissociates. Sometimes this will have function, sometimes it won't. Sometimes the only function of this is to recombine with the alpha subunit and shut it down. So that varies from G protein to G protein. And this will then go and do something in the cell. Depends on the type of alpha subunit it tends to be, blah, 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 so on and so forth. Now, the ability of this to bind GTP is time sensitive because eventually the GTP gets hydrolyzed. When it gets hydrolyzed, the GTP, the alpha subunit is no longer active and it'll rejoin with the beta gamma subunit and rejoin with the receptor. Then it's not active anymore. But if the receptor stays bound to ligand, you can repeatedly activate more and more of these G protein subunits. And you can keep activating it and you can keep getting activity inside the cell. Is there a limit to the activity you can get from the G protein? Yes, because eventually you can actually inactivate the receptor with phosphorylation and then remove it from the cell surface, and now the cell won't activate at all. This is a phenomenon called tolerance. Tolerance. Some cells show tolerance to drugs after a while because the receptor is permanently inactivated and then gets removed from the cell. Very good. Now let's go back to here. There, there. Okay. Now, second messengers. Cyclic AMP is not the only second messenger. We're going to say next time that calcium is also a second messenger. So there are several types of second messengers. Please keep in mind, these second messengers are virtually always generated as a result of a signal transduction pathway that you can take to the bank, pretty much. So enolate cyclase makes cyclic AMP from ATP. Enolate cyclase is only activated when you have the alpha subunit of the G protein activating it. This essentially is the case with glucagon and epinephrine activating certain cells. You increase their intracellular levels of cyclic AMP, like you see here, and cyclic AMP will go on to induce things like glycogen breakdown and things like that. All right, we are out of time for today. Remember, on Friday, we have our first quiz. So we'll do that at the beginning of class. I'll just pass it out. You'll have 5 minutes to take it. It'll be 5 questions, multiple choice, short fill-in, something like that, true, false. Well, it won't be a long test, just 5 questions. And then from there, we'll collect the test and then do a lecture after that. Okay? The beginning of this, yeah. Yeah. Very good. All right.
Dr. Baratovich, how are we going to take the quiz?
Say again, Evan.
I just asked how are we gonna take the quiz on Friday?
I can email it to you.
Okay.
I will email it
good.
to you, and if, let's see, Jesse, you'll still be on quarantine. Kelsey, you will too. Evan, you will too. John, are you officially on quarantine, or
Yeah, pretty much.
you are? Okay, then I'll just email it to all four of you. So you just take it and then send it back to me, okay?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, no problem.